Memento mori. These are the words which remind us we are mortal. During the Roman Empire, after a major military victory, generals would be paraded through the streets in triumph. These generals were idolized by the plebeians, viewed as blessed by the gods' favor, perhaps even being near divine themselves. Yet riding in the general's chariot was a slave whose sole responsibility was to whisper into the general's ear continuously the phrase, Respice post te, hominem te esse, memento mori. Or in my best English translation, look behind you, remember that you are but a man, remember that you will die. But perhaps men do not actually have to die. Man is just an animal, and not all animals have to die. Some have the potential to live forever. Some are technically immortal. And on today's podcast we will be talking about one of these animals, Turritopsis dohrnii, better known as the Immortal Jellyfish. But first I think it's best that we cover why animals age, and why aging eventually leads to death. Biological aging is known as senescence, and is characterized by a gradual deterioration of the organism's biological functions. This results in an increase in mortality and a reduction in the ability to produce offspring over time. In 2013, López-Otín and others produced a paper on the hallmarks of aging. These hallmarks included an accumulation of genetic mutations, a shortening of the telomeres. Telomeres are the repetitive nucleotide sequences which exist at the poles of each chromosome and protect the DNA from being destroyed by the DNA's repair system. The next one was epigenic alteration, that to result in a change in the processes which are involved in the underlying mechanisms of DNA expression. Then, a loss in the ability to produce correctly folded proteins called proteostasis. This results in a loss of the gene's ability to function. Then, there's a deregulated ability to sense what nutrients are needed to fuel cell's maintenance and growth, resulting in faster cell aging. And next, a reduction in the mitochondria's ability to produce enough energy to maintain healthy cells. And then, a ceasing of the cellular division known as cellular senescence. And then the exhaustion of the body's stem cells, resulting in a reduction in the body's ability to regenerate from damage. And lastly, changes in the ability for intercellular communication, resulting in an unregulated ability to react to hormones and pathogens. Well, now isn't that all lovely? Senescence seems to have many downsides for the individual, so why would something persist that has so many detriments to reproductive fitness? Why would aging evolve in the first place? Well, honestly, we don't actually fully understand why, but plenty of theories have been put forth, and I'm going to tell you about 3 of the most popular theories that I find interesting. The first theory is called Mutation Accumulation, the second is Antagonistic Plyotropy, and the third being the DNA damage error theory. Okay, let's begin with the Mutation Accumulation theory. This theory states that animals experience senescence as a result of the accumulation of deleterious mutations in the germline. That is the accumulation of genetic mutations which have a bad effect which can be passed on to the offspring. These deleterious mutations, however, start expressing themselves late in the animal's life, by the time that they have already reproduced, which means that natural selection cannot act on the deleterious mutations because reproduction has already occurred. When you couple this with the knowledge that many wild animals have already died from predators, disease, or accidents before they reach a ripe old age, the selection pressure for late life traits would be very low, while the selection pressure for animals to be fit and fertile during their youth would be very high. With most random mutations being deleterious and only the mutations which affect the young being highly selected against, then individuals can find themselves with high mutation accumulation once they are mature. This mutation accumulation affects the allocation of energy and time that are directed towards growth and reproduction over the animal's lifetime, with greater mutation accumulation accelerating senescence. This means that animals must reach their optimal reproductive potential earlier in life because their total reproductive lifespan is shortened due to the accumulation of deleterious late life mutations. The next theory is perhaps the most widely prevailing and is called Antagonistic Plyotropy. Plyotropy by itself means that a single mutation can cause multiple effects on the expression of varying phenotypes. The phenotype is the physical expression of the animal's gene. On the other hand, antagonistic plyotropy relates to a single gene that creates 2 traits, one being beneficial and the other being detrimental, and due to natural selection placing greater selective pressure on the animal's early life, genes that offer early in life benefits will be selected for, despite the same genes accumulating greater cost later in the animal's life. Okay, well, I think that has some merit to it. So let's move on to the final theory that we will look at, which is the DNA damage error theory. This theory postulates that due to DNA damage being omnipresent in the biological world, it is therefore a primary cause of aging. Over an animal's life, DNA damage occurs and this damage is normally repaired. However, over time, more and more mistakes are made by the DNA's repair system, and this means more damaged DNA is left uncorrected. This has the effect of impairing gene transcription, which causes the progressive loss of cellular and tissue function that define aging. So, animals age and eventually die for multiple proposed reasons. However, the immortal jellyfish, as its name suggests, is immortal. But what do we mean when we say an animal is biologically immortal? Well, putting it simply, a species is biologically immortal when its rate of mortality is stable over time. In other words, a young animal has the same rate of death as an older member of its species. I think it's important to state that biological immortality does not mean that an individual of a biologically immortal species cannot die. They very much can, from things such as random accidents, lack of nutrition, disease, or through physical conflict. It simply means that the rate of death over time is stable, and therefore the chance of dying from these things is consistent over that time. Biological immortality can also be applied to cells which are not subject to a Hayflick limit. The Hayflick limit is a limit which dictates how many times a cell can divide. There are some very interesting cancer cell lines that have managed to bypass the Hayflick limit, thereby making themselves biologically immortal. But I think this is a topic for a future podcast. Anywho, back to the topic at hand. The immortal jellyfish is a particularly interesting species to look at when we are discussing biological immortality, due to the way in which they achieve it. Immortal jellyfish start off their life as tiny larvae known as planulae. These planulae are capable of freely moving within water, and once they come into contact with a desired substrate, they can anchor themselves to it, and then form into what is known as a polyp. These polyps generally consist of an upward-facing tentacles attached to a small stalk, with its mouth being at the centre, and they can be found existing in colonies. As the polyp ages, it then forms into an extensively branched form from which medusa are formed. Medusa is just a fancy way of saying jellyfish. The medusa then detaches itself from the polyp, becoming free to swim in its surrounding environment, and they then eventually mature into an adult jellyfish, which can sexually reproduce. Now that the jellyfish is free, it has a very special way to achieve immortality. When it is exposed to stress, be it physical, environmental or biological, it can revert from its adult stage back into its polyp state. It is able to achieve this through a process called differentiation, in which cells are transformed from one mature type of cell into another mature type of cell without reverting back into a stem cell first. So imagine it as, say, an eye cell transforming into a skin cell, or the cells that make up your nails transforming themselves into bone. The fact that the immortal jellyfish is able to do this means that theoretically they can live forever. How amazing is that? So, now it wouldn't be the same for you and I, but could you imagine if humans had this ability? Maybe you're getting a bit old, you've had a lot of wear and tear, you could just decide, hey, screw being an old boy, I'd rather be a child again, and then revert back to your old self. Wounds healed, aging damage corrected, and you come out again bright and new. Well, this is basically what these jellyfish do. I think that the evolution of this ability is quite astounding. Not only does it allow for an individual genetic line to maximise the chance to procreate by having potentially timeless period to reproduce, it also, once reverted back to its polyp, allows for the creation of genetically identical clone medusas. That's right, all jellyfish produced from a single polyp are actually clones, and these clones are then able to reproduce once mature, or revert back to a polyp again if stressed. I imagine this ability makes these jellyfish not only capable of maximising their genetic output, but also allows them a better chance of surviving in a changing and thus stressful environment. Perhaps this has aided this species in being able to spread throughout the world's oceans. But really, we are only just scratching the surface, because we don't really actually know all that much about them. We know that they are technically immortal, but how can we use that to benefit humanity or benefit other animals of the world to any great degree? Well, I guess that's for the scientists and researchers to find out, and then for me and you to learn about. Or hell, if you're feeling adventurous and maybe this species has really piqued your interest, maybe you could be the one to find out what these animals can do and then tell the world about it. But I think overall, even though we don't know too much about this species, I think this species is not only unique, but it's amazing within its uniqueness. And I'm excited to discover what new and interesting things this species can teach us about senescence in the future. Okay, it's a short one for this month. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to this episode of the Zoology Podcast. I hope it didn't drag on for a lifetime, but even if it did, maybe we'll all be biologically immortal by now, so there's no harm done. I hope everyone makes it to the next episode, and I'll leave you all with an everlasting goodbye.